Good evening, everyone. My name is Joseph Cronin, and I'm the director of the Leo Baeck Institute, London. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this event, which is jointly hosted by the Leo Baeck Institute, London, the Wiener Holocaust Library, and the British German Association. Before we begin, a quick note. This event is being recorded, so when we come to the Q&A, if you would like to ask a question, please be aware that your voice and image may appear in the recording. If you would prefer not to be recorded, you are welcome to type your question into the chat and I will read it out. So, here's how this evening's event will run. Firstly, our speaker will introduce his book for around 25 minutes. This will be followed with a discussion with Dr. Toby Simpson, director of the Wiener Holocaust Library, for around 20 minutes. And then we will open the floor to audience Q&A for around 20 minutes. So without further ado, it is a pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker, Professor Hermann Beck, a distinguished historian of modern Germany and professor at the University of Miami. His latest book, Before the Holocaust, challenges long-held assumptions about anti-Semitic violence in early Nazi Germany. Just last month, it was awarded the 2024 Yad Vashem Book Prize for its groundbreaking insights into the Nazi takeover. And we're going to hear a bit more about those insights this evening, which I'm very excited about. So, Professor Beck, we're delighted to have you with us this evening. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted to have a chance to speak about my book. I take it everyone can hear me, right? Yes, good. Well, let me begin by saying a few words how I embarked upon this project. Over 20 years ago, when researching another book on the relationship between conservatives and Nazis during the Nazi seizure of power, I came across a great deal of anti-Semitic violence in the late winter and early spring of 1933. And that astonished me. It seemed paradoxical. The violence began a mere 5 weeks after Hitler became chancellor. You might remember Hitler was appointed to the position on the 30th of January. This violence began on the 6th of March. And very, very shortly after the end of the Weimar Republic. Also, I don't remember having read much about this anti-Semitic violence. So I thought, well, I know a good deal about the period. How come I never really heard about this? Also, there had been some anti-Semitic violence during the Weimar Republic, not very much, also not very much at its end. So where all of a sudden did this enormous upsurge of anti-Semitic violence come from? And when I speak of upsurge, well, I mean, within a very short period of time, I actually found hundreds of instances of anti-Semitic attacks. Then I, well, looked for further evidence, went to other archives. That wasn't easy because the anti-Semitic violence was not recorded in police files. In fact, I often came across the sentence, die Polizei ist nicht dazu da, Juden zu beschützen. So the police kept out. The police also didn't record these crimes. And so in my archival research, I had to go a winding path. For example, I looked at Wiedergutmachungsakten, recompensation files from the 1950s. I looked at documents from the British military government in Germany after 1945. There was a large holding, crimes committed during the National Socialist Revolution in 1933. In any case, in total, I went to more than 20 archives and I found evidence of more than 1,000 anti-Semitic attacks, many dozens of murder cases, and all of this within the span of, well, as I said, it began 5 weeks after Hitler came to power. It sort of then petered out in the later spring, but it was a formidable record of anti-Semitic violence. Now, needless to say, no official figures exist. The German government, I mean, the Reichsgovernment and the governments of the different Länder hotly denied that any anti-Semitic attacks had taken place. Also, there are virtually no records. In fact, there is one official figure we have by a journalist who wrote for the New York Times, a man by the name of Michael Williams, and he had toured Germany in the late spring between April and June of 1933. He witnessed many of these instances of anti-Semitic violence, and according to him, and he wrote this up in the New York Times, there were about 3,000 incidents, actual acts of anti-Semitic violence, and 300 murders. Now I can see, my research could sort of bear out the figure of 3,000. I found evidence of several dozen murders, not of 300. But if we include the many suicides that happened in the wake of the April boycott, we can also reach that particular figure. Now, let us have a look at what happened in concrete detail. And let us turn to the different types of anti-Semitic crimes. The first targets were foreign Jews. At the time, in 1933, there were about 98,000 foreign Jews living in Germany, living in Nazi Germany. Of these, 80,000 were Ostjuden, and these Ostjuden were the initial targets of violence. The perpetrators, all of them, were Nazi stormtroopers. At the time, there were about 500,000 of them. Most of the attacks took place in Berlin, the Ruhr, and the large cities of Saxony. In fact, I put together a map, and maybe we can show this map of anti-Semitic violence of the Toby, if you could, or Joe, if you could show it, where the main hotspots were. Also, in addition, there were numerous attacks on synagogues, and what happened was that many of these SA and SS men who perpetrated these attacks wore uniforms of the auxiliary police, the Hilfspolizei that was recruited at the time from Stahlhelm members and from Nazi stormtroopers. So in a sense, they were vested with official state authority. Now the situation was quite different with German Jews. It was different because attacks on foreign Jews were recorded with foreign consulates. In other words, when someone with Polish nationality was attacked, he could go to the Polish consulate and complain. With German Jews, this was very different. Unless they themselves managed to bring the crime to the attention of the authorities, well, no one would ever know about it. But I found an enormous volume of violence against German Jews. In fact, let me go through the different categories, and you'll see much of this is really unknown. Let's begin with what is known, and that's, of course, the big boycott, the nationwide boycott of April 1st, 1933. Here are, in this context, there are two facts that are of interest. I found evidence of a great deal of anti-Semitic violence during the actual day of the boycott. Those of you who are familiar with the time will know that apart from one very prominent murder, the official reading is there was no violence on the day of the boycott. That's absolutely false. Also, the boycott then went on in many localities. For example, in Pforzheim, it lasted well into May. Also, there were numerous local prohibitions against buying in Jewish shops for German civil servants. In other words, they were told, throughout the entire period, throughout the entire year 1933, you cannot buy in Jewish shops. And if you do, your names will be posted in local newspapers on billboards at the local Rathaus. So in other words, the boycott of April 1st is far more multifaceted and far more, well, pernicious than we actually know. Next category of anti-Semitic crime, abduction. This was a widely practiced but little known category. And what actually happened was many Jewish businessmen, lawyers, doctors, other professionals were abducted, severely beaten, then let go. Many were told to leave the country, or else they would be murdered. And this was no empty threat. In fact, I found evidence of several murder cases in this connection. For example, in Wiesbaden was a famous case, Samuel Rosenstrauch. He had been beaten up in March. He was then told to leave the country. He didn't. Then a month later, after he had recovered from his wounds, the SA came by and actually shot him outside his apartment, point blank range. Next category, an indirect form of violence, also very, very little known. That's the so-called perfidy ordinance, the Heimtücke-Verordnung. Now, this Heimtücke-Verordnung was directed against rumors. The Nazis were afraid that people would talk about their misdeeds. And so this Heimtücke-Verordnung, this perfidy ordinance, was designed to punish rumors that were harmful to the reputation of the Reich. And in fact, in 1933, more than 4,000 people were punished under the terms of this Heimtücke-Verordnung. Interesting fact in our context, German Jews were punished far more severely than other Germans. Well, the Norman German would then get a fine, a few hundred marks, and German Jews would get lengthy prison terms. And this really was consistent. Next category, also little known but extremely widespread. These were the pillory marches, Prangermärsche. So what happened was that victims were forcibly paraded through towns on a kind of ox cart, accompanied by a posse of Nazi stormtroopers. And usually they, they had fallen foul of some Nazi party member, of some Nazi stormtrooper, and now they were, as I said, forcibly paraded through town with a sign around their neck. So-and-so is the biggest swindler and racketeer in Pinneberg. There was one case north of Hamburg at Pinneberg. So these were, standard charges that fed into current anti-Semitic prejudice. And of course, you can imagine what this did to the reputation of people who had been paraded through a town for an hour or so. During this Prangermarsch, the mood of a public festival prevailed. People would sort of throw potatoes or tomatoes or rotten eggs at them, and everyone was cheerful. And by the way, these Prangermärsche also happened to opponents of the regime. A number of Social Democrats were also paraded around in Prangermärsche. Then also there was a different kind of public branding. Already in the spring of 33, Germans who had amorous relationships with Jews could see their names and addresses published in local newspapers. I remember one paper in a big city on the Rhine, big headline, Judenliebchen sehen dich an. And then, there was a long list of people who had supposedly intimate contact with German Jews. Finally, last category, there were the murder cases. Now, what's interesting, this connection, as I said, I found evidence of several dozen murder cases, enough to classify them into 3 categories. Already in 1933, a number of culprits were apprehended and actually put in jail, but then let go in July under an amnesty for crimes committed during the National Socialist Revolution. So actually obvious murderers were then let go again. What's interesting here, in all of these cases, in all of the cases I describe in detail, the murderers were then further prosecuted after 1945. And In some cases, this went on throughout the 1950s into the 1960s. Let me just say a word about the different categories of murder cases. There were quite a number of murders committed on the spur of the moment. These murders initially were meant as attacks, simple attacks to beat someone up, but in several cases, then the victim fought back, was far stronger than the attackers had assumed, and then was shot. Second category, the staged incidents, the so-called shot while trying to escape murder. What happened was that the Nazis had rounded up a number of people who sort of had fallen foul of the Nazi party before 33, and they wanted to have them out of the way. And then quite often they were driven to a forest, told that they could go, they could leave, could run away, which was what they did, and then they were shot in the back. So this too happened quite often. Finally, there were the revenge murders. And this happened to quite a number of local social democratic politicians or other people who had fallen foul of local Nazis or local prominent Nazis. And again, as I said, in some instances, murder suspects were apprehended, but then again let go. But then justice eventually reached them during the 1950s and early 60s. Well, maybe we get a chance to talk more about this later. In any case, the anti-Semitic violence of the late winter and spring of 1933 would remain unparalleled until Reichskristallnacht, until the pogrom of November 9th, 1938. The volume was immense, and as you can see here in our map, there were certain, well, it was basically Reichsweit. In other words, it was sort of it occurred all over Germany with a number of focal points: Ruhr district, Rhine-Main area, Saxony, Berlin, East Prussia, and Bavaria. Now a word about the difference to the Weimar Republic. Now, there had been some anti-Semitic violence during the Weimar Republic, especially at the beginning in 1923, and also again at the end. Big difference. During the Weimar Republic, perpetrators could never be certain that they would get off scot-free. In fact, in a number of cases, there were a number of attacks on synagogues in Frankfurt in 1926. The attackers got lengthy prison sentences. Now they knew that they would get off. There was a very big difference. Also, well, the political opponents to the Nazi Party, the Social Democrats and the left liberals and the Center Party, well, they were all fighting for their own survival, and they didn't have the strength or the energy nor the interest to really do much and to speak out on behalf of German Jews. Another interesting aspect, already at the time, contemporary observers ascribed a very clear function and motivation to these anti-Semitic attacks. Sebastian Haffner, whom we all know, whose memoirs we all know, Defying Hitler, wrote at the time in 1939 in his book, Germany, Jekyll and Hyde, he said, Nazi organizations used these anti-Semitic attacks to excel within their peer group. Nazis themselves, they try to outdo others through their brutality, thereby demonstrating allegiance to the Nazi cause. And here literally it says, it sort of brought about a kind of bonding of the Nazi in-group through the iron trammels of jointly committed crimes. Of course, that sounds familiar, and we are familiar with this from, gangs in our own day. But at the time, this was quite widespread. The German sociologist Max Horkheimer, we know him as head of the Frankfurt School, also wrote in the 1930s, anti-Semitic attacks were used as a means of intimidating the population at large by showing that the system will stop at nothing. Pogroms are aimed at the onlookers. I also found that very persuasive and convincing. But now let's go on to the second main part of my book, parts 1 and 2, or I should say the third main part, because parts 1 and 2 deal with anti-Semitic violence. Part 3 deals with the key issue of the reaction of the elites to anti-Semitic violence. Now, I must preface this by saying that by 1935 or 1938, any form of protest would have been extremely hazardous and dangerous. In 1933, in March and April 1933, German institutions had still a certain leeway. Institutions still could protest. Individuals couldn't. Already at the time, it would have been very, very dangerous for individual Germans to speak out. Um, Actually, Nazi violence made no social distinctions. In other words, no matter how prominent or how well known you were, that really did not save you from Nazi attacks, even in mid-March. But as I said, institutions could still have spoken out. So let's see which institutions still could have spoken out. We must clearly say the parties that had strongly opposed anti-Semitic violence through the Weimar Republic, the German Democratic Party, the DDP, and the SPD, they were now gone, as I said, fighting for their own survival. Among political parties, there really was only one political party that potentially could have protested, and that party was the DNVP, at whose reaction I already looked in my other book. But of course, we all know that German conservatives at the time, well, their own past was tinged with anti-Semitism, so they were very unlikely spokesmen for Jewish causes. But still, they could have protested, and some of their individual members actually did. The German army at the time, the Reichswehr, small but highly professional, also could have protested, but, and I found that very surprising, army officers were not interested in the issue. I spent a great deal of time at the military archives in Freiburg. I only found two very slender volumes that dealt with anti-Semitism, and they only dealt with the introduction of the Aryan clause in the Reichswehr, then in 1934. So nothing. And I found quite a bit of evidence that German officers were completely indifferent to the issue. In fact, after a good deal of reading and archival research, I realized that the only institutions that were in a position to protest was the bureaucracy, that is to say, the administrative and judicial branches of the bureaucracy, the Protestant Church, the Catholic Church, and as I already said, the DNVP. So let's have a look at their reaction, and let's begin with the institution that had to deal with complaints from foreign consulates, that is to say, the bureaucracy. So they really were confronted with many, many hundreds of complaints from the Polish, Austrian, Romanian, Czech, and Dutch and American consulates about violence perpetrated against their citizens. Now, as you can imagine, German officials were caught in a predicament. They knew that the substance of the complaints, that these complaints were real. The substance was true. That was obvious. They knew that these complaints were justified, but they also knew that solidarity with the perpetrators was expected from them. So they were really caught in this very strange dilemma. And well, in dealing with the complaints, in their responses, raison d'etat prevailed. That is to say, officials often distorted the truth to protect the image of the Reich. We might say the bureaucracy assiduously worked towards what they assumed the new regime expected from them. So what happened, for example, was that in order to justify attacks, victims were often labeled communists. Communists who had made seditious statements supporting communist subversion, and that is why they had to be attacked. And well, because after all, we're just dealing with communists. To give you one example, there was an SA attack on a synagogue in Dresden on the 25th of March, 1933. And this attack on the synagogue was justified by the claim that the SA had to break up a communist party meeting there. This was done to give the attacks a semblance of legality, basically. Um, then I should also mention that this excuse of attacks only being directed against communists, this was also used with middle class victims, where, of course, I mean, this argument was really ridiculous. A word about the reaction of the Protestant church. Keep in mind, at the time, Germany was two-thirds Protestant, a little bit under one-third Catholic, just under 1% of the population was Jewish, 3% had no religious affiliation at all. But the Protestant church, well, was a pillar of society. Also, Protestant church leaders had spoken out against Nazi violence during the Weimar Republic. A number of prominent Protestant church leaders had protested against the murder at Potempa in August of 1932. Also, Protestant church leaders had received many warnings and pleas for help from their own members. So, many German Protestants wrote to their bishops and to their leading clergy saying, well, do something. Look what is happening. You must protest. So there was a great deal of pressure from them, also pressure from foreign churches, pressure from the World Association of Churches. So in other words, Protestant church leaders knew what was going on, and they finally, after much hesitation and prevarication, they met at the end of April. 40 church leaders met and decided what to do about the issue, whether they would protest or not. In this meeting on the 25th of April, the overwhelming majority decided to remain quiet. There was only one church leader, a Protestant church leader, Wilhelm von Bechmann, who spoke out in favor of protest. The others decided that silence was the best policy to pursue. Now let's have a look at the arguments in favor of remaining silent. I mean, why would you, as a Protestant church leader, and after all, the Protestant church at the time sort of portrayed itself as the conscience of the nation. So how could you remain silent? Now, many of the church leaders actually voiced their contentment with the new government. They said, well, the present government is wonderful. They saved Germany from falling under a communist yoke. In many instances, Nazi policies were wholeheartedly endorsed. So in other words, contentment with the new regime. Many said, finally, we have an Obrigkeit again. I mean, a real authority to look up to. That was one main factor. Number two, fear of alienating an increasingly powerful regime. That was also palpable. Number three, obvious satisfaction that foreign infiltration had been stopped. And overall agreement with the government's justified protective measures. In short, the leadership recommended, they made it clear, no action will be taken. We also don't want to fall foul of this new powerful regime with which we basically are in agreement. The Catholic Church, very similar picture here. But again, we have to emphasize, the rank and file wanted to speak out. I found many instances of, simple Catholics writing to their bishops saying, well, we have to do something, please protest. The leadership was different. Now, for example, in one prominent Catholic church leader at the time was the Archbishop of Munich, Michael von Faulhaber. He mentioned in response to pleas for help from simple Catholics, he wrote back saying, well, in my opinion, German Jews can help themselves. It's far more important for us to protect Catholic schools and Catholic civil servants. We shouldn't get entangled in all of this. The senior Catholic archbishop, that was Adolf Bertram, Archbishop of Breslau, and just on the day before the boycott, he wrote to the other archbishops, there were 5 in total, and he said, well, should we speak out? Should we speak out against anti-Semitic violence and also against this boycott? And then, in in his letter, he answered his own question. He said, well, I myself don't really think so. Why interfere in a field that doesn't concern us? It might be actually harmful to the church. Also, in the past, and here I quote, the largely Jewish-dominated press consistently observed silence when Catholics in different countries were persecuted. Well, confronted with such obvious doubts of the advisability of any sort of appeal to the government, the other archbishops fell in line. There was one of them, Archbishop Gröber of Freiburg, who thought otherwise, but he was then very quickly brought into line. So the Catholic Church also did not do anything. By the way, if we then look ahead into the Third Reich, a number of people who remained quiet in 1933 would then protest later on. Faulhaber then courageously protested against some Nazi measures in December 33, also again during the war. Also, some Protestant church leaders who had been quiet in 33 would then speak out in a measured way during the war. Finally, Hitler's coalition partner, the DNVP, the German National People's Party, well, here too we have the same picture. Many rank and file members wrote to the leadership saying, well, we can't square this with our conscience. After all, we are conservative Germans. This is violence. This shouldn't happen. This kind of Radau Antisemitismus. The leaders remained silent. In effect, as I showed in my earlier book here, the DNVP leadership in some regions they even helped to organize the April boycott. Well, again, reasons for being silent and reasons for not wanting to get involved was fear of Nazi terror, terror against their own party. Also, the growing popularity of the Nazi regime. Everyone was afraid to interfere with the enormous popularity of the regime. And also, in the case of the conservatives, fear of appearing judenfreundlich, to be sort of look favorably at German Jews. Okay, a few words in conclusion. The book shows, I mean, here this latest book we are talking about today, it shows that there was a great deal of anti-Semitic violence during the period of the Nazi takeover. It began exactly 5 weeks after Hitler came to power. It then petered out gradually during the later spring of 1933. Point number 2, the German elites were aware of it. In other words, the upper ranks in the bureaucracy who dealt with the anti-Semitic attacks, the leadership of the Protestant Church who received complaints from its rank and file members and from other churches, and also the leadership of the Catholic Church, they all knew it. They had all received admonishments from its members to get involved and to protest. The same with the DNVP. We should also mention that parts of the German public were also aware of it. Of course, the map here shows that anti-Semitic violence, to a certain extent, you can see in some rural regions, not much happened. But as I mentioned earlier, many of these Prangermärsche, these pillory marches, were actually sort of printed up in the newspapers. So I found quite a number of newspaper clips. Today in Kassel, this and this happened. So people, of course, this hadn't happened to the Weimar Republic. It hadn't happened during the Empire. It was an early modern medieval custom. So people must have read this and I thought, oh my God. So if this was known. So this was widely known and people at the time also felt. They felt that they should have protested. Let me just give you one example. In 1946, Konrad Adenauer, we all know him as the first Chancellor of West Germany. In 1946, after the war, he wrote to another Catholic theologian. You might remember Adenauer was a practicing Catholic. And he wrote, in my opinion, the German people and the bishops and clergy bear their fair share of the blame for the events in the concentration camps. The Jewish pogroms of 1933 and 1938 happened in full public view. I mean, please note here, he refers to the events of 1933 as a pogrom. I believe that if all the bishops had publicly protested from their pulpits on a given day, much could have been avoided. This did not happen, and there is no excuse for it. So in other words, he and many, many others knew that this had been a very severe failing. So why did the elites remain silent, and why did they passively observe the exclusion of their Jewish citizens, the exclusion, and much worse? The short answer to this question, the very short answer to this question, lies in a mixture of fear, strong latent anti-Semitism, and also the initially very strong agreement with the policies of the Nazi regime. The reactions of the conservative elites were shaped by a mixture of indifference among army generals, caution, fear, and blatant anti-Semitism in the case of the churches, and in the case of the Protestant church, we must also add strong agreement with the earlier Nazi measures, with the policies of the regime, willing complicity with the bureaucracy, and all of this was a blend of motivations characteristic of large sections of German society in 1933. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Herman, for that fascinating overview of your book. Lots to think about there. Now we're going to move on to the second part of our event this evening, which is the conversation between Professor Beck and Dr. Toby Simpson. So, hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Joe. I want to start by congratulating you, Professor Beck, on this extraordinary study. The detailed archival research you've done is very impressive, and the way you've hugely enriched our knowledge and understanding of this crucial turning point. It really has been eye-opening for me, and I wanted to mention that it's especially interesting from my point of view. Working here at the Wiener Library, because Alfred Wiener was, of course, gathering information in the 1920s and early 1930s about the anti-Semitic activities of the Nazi Party. But actually, there was a break in their activities when Wiener was forced into exile. And the office he set up in Amsterdam began reporting again, but only from 1934. And indeed, the original archive that he had gathered had to be destroyed out of concern of exactly the kinds of violence that you've described. So in a way, your research helps us to understand why Alfred Wiener's first archive had to be destroyed. So it's very it's really a pleasure to be here and to discuss this with you. I wanted to ask as my first question, why has it taken so long for this material to come to light? I can see, of course, from your map, much of what did happen in the eastern part of Germany, but actually much also in the West. And so it's not a case that these archives weren't there and available to be consulted. Yes, you had to do a lot of work to really unveil this picture, but it could have been done earlier. Why wasn't it?
I think there were two main reasons. Number one, the first reason really has to do with the archival situation. It really took me a very long time to assemble all of these cases, simply because the police didn't record instances of anti-Semitic violence. So I think when I think of the winding paths I had to pursue to get my hand on substantive evidence, that might have been one reason. Number two, I only pursued this because I thought it was so very paradoxical that so much had happened at the time, and that that we actually don't have a study of all of this anti-Semitic violence. I suspect, you see, at the time, already in March 1933, there was outspoken opposition abroad. British papers, the American press, newspapers in France protested against this anti-Semitic violence. In the United States, there was a great meeting at Madison Square Garden, protest meeting against Nazi anti-Semitism, and that actually happened before April 1st. The German government responded by open denials. Now, what was interesting, even figures that had some moral authority, such as the Protestant church leader Dibelius or Michael von Faulhaber, actually gave public speeches openly denying these attacks. Dibelius, a very famous man, gave a radio address to an American audience on the 4th of April, and he said, please don't be fooled. I mean, nothing is happening in Germany. It's true, during the 1st of April, there was this one prominent murder of Friedrich Schumm, but otherwise nothing is happening. Let me tell you, I really mean it. And of course, he was believed. And I guess because of all of these denials, later historians thought, well, I mean, there was a little bit, but not all that much. And so I guess, no one just took the trouble to undertake this enormous research. I could only do it because, well, I had the time, and I didn't have any time pressure on me. I began work on this in 2007. The book was published in 2022. I did much else besides, but still, I mean, this was a very, very long time, and I was in no hurry to get it done. And oddly enough, I never thought that someone might preempt me. I've never thought, oh, soon a study about this is going to come out. No, I was sure no one would touch the subject.
If I could follow up on that issue of murder cases, because of course there were people who had a really powerful interest in this information not coming to light or not being thoroughly investigated, and there's the issue of statutes of limitations, which also had an influence on the question of justice more generally for the murders perpetrated during the Holocaust. So one of the most fascinating aspects of your book is you really go into quite a lot of detail about this issue of the murders committed and also what happened to suspected murders after World War II. So it'd be great if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, what is startling at first, I mentioned these three categories. Murders committed on the spur of the moment. One prominent example I mentioned in the book is that of Max Kassel, a dairy merchant in Wiesbaden, and he had fallen foul of the Nazi party through his maid. He dismissed the maid, who was engaged to a local Nazi. Then a group of Nazis came, wanted to beat him up. He was a strong man, he resisted. So in order to subdue him, they had to shoot him many, many times. 2 days later, two of the main suspects were actually arrested. Then, other people also involved. There was a whole group of half a dozen Nazi stormtroopers who were involved. They were all arrested. Then in the summer, after the passing of the second amnesty of the 25th of July, they were again released, let go. And then after World War II, the law court investigation, the prosecution was continued. What was interesting was that two of the main instigators got off relatively lightly, a few months imprisonment. One person, sort of a typical Nazi ruffian, who had killed many other people, who then also had fallen foul of the Nazi party because of his many crimes, a man by the name of Franz Reep, and I characterize him in the book. He was sentenced to 10 years of heavy labor and 15 years imprisonment. So it was the lower charges really were published, and the larger fry was let off lightly. Same also with the second category, the shot while trying to escape murder. Here, one prominent example is the secretary of Kurt Eisner. Kurt Eisner, the socialist prime minister of Bavaria after World War I, and then the secretary's name was Felix Fechenbach, and he had been apprehended in Detmold. And then, the Nazi authorities said, well, let's transfer him to Dachau, so trip across Germany. And, in the middle, someplace in Hessen, the prison truck stopped in a forest, and he was told he could go, but he knew what awaited him, so he clung to the truck, and finally they prized him loose, chased him into the forest, and killed him. Again, after World War II, because Fechenbach was a prominent person, after World War II, the investigation was continued. The driver of the prison truck, some lowly SS man, was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. The others, again, the instigators, got off very, very lightly. Third category, now here, what is interesting, and that happened quite often, if during this period you were, or you didn't even have to be a very high Nazi functionary, but if you were a Nazi functionary and had power, you could actually take brutal revenge on your opponents. So here, among other cases, I discussed that of a dentist who had fallen foul of a local Nazi, in fact, of matter of a woman, and I think he had been successful where the local Nazi hadn't been, and then he was abducted and well, tortured and brutally killed. And he hadn't done anything wrong. In fact, he had fought for a Freikorps in 1919, so he was an eminently national-minded German. Again, his case then was followed up after the war and into the late 1950s. And well, 4 or 5 people got short-term prison sentences of a few months. Still, it's good to know that in basically all of the cases I look at, all of these cases had a corollary that went beyond 1945. But at the same time, many people had been arrested in the spring and summer of 1933, and then, even though they were obvious murderers, were let go.
That's fascinating. One last question before I hand over to audience questions is about the relevance today, because I think it is profoundly relevant today to think about how elites respond when norms are transgressed, because we've seen a lot of norms in society transgressed recently across the globe. And I just wondered if you could say something about that balance between fear and enthusiasm that you alluded to. What do you think your study tells us about how elites respond? I mean, things like pillory marches, that wasn't a normal part of German society. So what does this tell us about how elites respond when norms are transgressed?
I'm not sure whether we can generalize between what happened then and what is happening now. To a certain extent, the reaction of the elites was to a certain extent time specific, because one reason for their silence was palpable fear. Now, if they had, stood together and spoken out, they might have been successful. They might not. What is interesting is what struck me was the enormous indifference of, for example, the army leadership. Then what was also interesting, the rank and file in all organizations, churches, and the bureaucracy all over protested, and it's also in the German Conservative Party. They all said, please do something. The leadership was extremely reluctant. And then we see, for example, in the case of the churches, many Protestant church leaders were ready to protest and to speak out in March. But then by the time this meeting I mentioned earlier came about at the end of April, the regime had become so popular. And they also had been won over to a certain extent that initially there had been at least half a dozen church leaders who wanted to speak out. By the end of April, one person was left. And oddly enough, this man, Wilhelm von Pechmann, then later converted to Catholicism. The element of popularity is tremendously important. In effect, now I'm working on a new study that will take me another 10 years on the Nazi seizure of power, a more general history. There hasn't really been any since Brahasauer Schulz, since this huge book from 1960. And what I find is that there were two elements that rule this entire period. Number one, fear of Nazi brutality. That really was palpable. Number two, and that's something you don't expect, genuine enthusiasm. People really felt this is wonderful. Now we finally have an Obrigkeit again. This Nazi regime brings us all together. Let's forget all the negative things we've heard about Hitler. So that really surprised me. And that element was very, very strong, as you said, Toby, very strong with the elites.
Yeah, so
They
it's,
were then able.
it's also institutions as well that you examine in your book, as well as the people at the very top of those institutions. So I just want to conclude by and hand over to Joe for the audience questions by saying I'm just incredibly grateful that you have undertaken this research. It's incredibly impressive, and it really does add to our knowledge of the period. So thank you, Herman.
Well, thank you.
Yes, great. Thanks to you both. Okay, so we have about 15, 20 minutes for audience questions. Now, if you like, you can type your question in the chat. If you'd prefer to speak your question, please raise your hand virtually. And if you can, please also type your name in the chat or some way of indicating that you'd like to ask a question, and I'll do my best to field everything that comes in. Actually, I've been sent a direct message already with a question, so I'll start by reading that. I don't think anyone else can see it. It says, my interest is particularly in Breslau. I found that the first officially organized violence against Jews in Breslau took place on 11th March 1933, when Jewish solicitors and judges were assaulted by the SR. One, Ludwig Furder, uh, who, according to the Breslau synagogue lists, lived lived at Nikolai Stadtgraben, was beaten over the head with a lead bar. One of his colleagues, Walter Eckstein, was tortured for 5 days until he died. In June 1933, NS students at the university announced a boycott of any remaining Jewish staff. Tear gas was thrown in lectures given by Jewish academics, and Jewish students were attacked. The question, are there any suggestions for resources specifically regarding Breslau? Is this a particularly unusual case?
It's very true. I mean, Silesia and especially Breslau really was a hotspot. And as the gentleman said, that's where the violence began very, very early, already on the 11th of March. There is one, regarding Silesia and regarding Breslau, one very interesting memoir by Walter Tausk, Tausk. Walter Tausk, it's in my bibliography. Um, and it's called something like Breslauer Tagebuch. And I quote it repeatedly because he gives us examples of unspeakable brutality. And I quote these at length. What happened in March and April. And it's a very, very moving document. He himself was a Handlungsreisender, and well, also of course directly affected. I mean, it then ruined his business, the fact that he was Jewish. But he gives us countless examples of, as I said, unspeakable brutality. And also reading the book, you think, oh my God, how many other people must have witnessed this? Um, Also regarding Breslau, the very famous historian Fritz Stern was born in Breslau, and you may want to have a look at one of his essay collections. Um, Oh, I forgot. It was published in 1986. I forgot the exact title. Sort of collection of essays, also about his own youth in Breslau. His father was a prominent doctor, and then later Stern was forced to leave in 1938. They left, and he mentions very movingly. Um, he mentions the father stood next to him. Tears streamed down his face. And little Fritz Stern, who was only 12 years old, said, and I was so relieved. And then later in his life, Stern went back to Breslau, only to find a Polish family living in the villa of his grandmother. The Stern family was a prominent family. So what you might want to do is read his book, Five Lives in Germany, his autobiography. Much about the book is focuses on Breslau.
Great. So we have a few questions now. A couple of people would like to speak their questions. So Catherine Slattery, I'll come to you first.
Yes. I heard what Dr. Beck said regarding these events being unparalleled until Kristallnacht. And I'm wondering how you would rank the incidents of random violence against Jewish Germans between 1934 and 1936, or even up till 39? Would it be about the same, a lot less, or maybe more but hidden? And if it is less during that period, how do you account for that downturn in violence after 1934?
So basically, if we look at a sort of a chronological map of violence, as I said, it began with this enormous explosion in March and April and early May 1933. Then it gradually went down. There were a number of incidences in 1934, a number of murders in Bavaria, outside Munich. Then again in 1935, in Munich, there was, widespread violence, but it was sort of localized. There was never, until 1938, we won't again encounter this Reichswide violence as we did in 1933. Then the violence really abated, really went down late 35 throughout 1936. Of course, the reason for that was the Olympic Games. The Nazis wanted to be on their best behavior. And also remember, at the time, all these signs were taken down. There were, many towns and villages had signs, "Hier sind Juden unerwünscht." Now, these signs were taken down. Then, during 1937, violence gathered again momentum. And of course, 1938, well, then again, it's exploded together with other legal measures. By the way, I also have one chapter on legal measures. The April legislation that also was connected with anti-Semitic violence. But of course, by 1938, well, every human being in Nazi Germany had to have witnessed violence, anti-Semitic violence.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, and I
Thank you.
think John Halliday, you have your hand raised.
Hi, sorry, just unmute myself and show my face as well. Thank you very much. Wow. I was just really interested in a couple of things, having lived in East Germany, West Germany, Austria. But first of all, a question about Victor Klemperer, whose wonderful sort of memoir, LTI or LTE, documents really from a very early stage the way that the Nazi ideology had been taken over, not just by Nazi party members, but by the general German public and even friends of his and acquaintances who were otherwise liberal. So whilst what you've done, Hermann, is fantastic in the detail, I suppose it didn't really surprise me that you'd come out with this stuff. But it's really telling that it's taken you to actually get such an extraordinary amount of detail into it. What was interesting, I spent a year in East Germany in the GDR, 1979 to 1980, and Victor Klemperer's work LTE, which was published in the GDR, actually became a bit of a kind of a Bible for those opponents of the regime who saw similar behaviors going on in East Germany in the way that people were terrified of the power of the state. There were a lot of similarities. So LTE, for a lot of young East Germans that I knew, became a sort of handbook to help them understand what had happened in their own country in the GDR post-war. Don't want to go into any more than that, but I did have a question. You've obviously had a lot of access to West German archives. Can you tell us, Hermann, what your findings are in terms of how these, Nazi thugs found justice or not in post-war Soviet occupation zone and then the German Democratic Republic? I'd be interested in that.
Well, of course, in 1933, they all got away. No one really was prosecuted.
Yeah.
I went to archives in Dresden also, and in Mecklenburg-Schwerin. So I don't think that in East Germany there was no further prosecution. In other words, the East German regime was not interested. What happened in West Germany was relatives of the victims were still there. They then appealed to the authorities. Also, they initially then appealed to the British police and the British zone of occupation. In the East, well, people had other problems. That was, too long ago. And after all, these were just individual murders, or well, big deal after what happened in the meantime. So East Germany did not pay any attention to this. Also, please keep in mind, and Jürgen Kuczynski mentions this in his memoirs, East Germany went through a phase of very strong anti-Semitism early on. During Stalin's last years, he had become anti-Semitic, the doctor's blood, and so that also swapped over into East Germany. And Jürgen Kuczynski, that famous statistician and convinced communist, mentioned this in his autobiography. He had been in England. He then returned to East Germany, and there he was horrified to find, well, open anti-Semitism. I think when the wall came down, there were only 1,100 people in East Germany who were Jewish. The others had left.
Yeah.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take one from the chat before coming back to the gentleman with his hand raised. Sharon Stern has asked, do you think these times are more dangerous as there are easier ways to spread misinformation? She lives in the US.
Well, there's, one thing we have to keep in mind. Please remember what I've been talking about happened in Nazi Germany. Now, it began very early on, but Hitler was chancellor. Well, it happened in a nascent dictatorship that was just about to build up. So, whenever I talk about my book, inevitably the question comes up, well, what about today? Don't we see the same today? It's very difficult to make these analogies, really. Also, another factor we tend to forget, as I said, all these crimes were perpetrated by, most of them, no, virtually all of them, by Nazi stormtroopers. Until the 5th of March, these Nazi stormtroopers had focused on the political opposition against Hitler. That is to say, throughout February, they were busy going after Center Party members, after Social Democrats, beating up communists. So there was an enormous elements of violence in society. So a very unique and very, very different situation. Also, there were 500,000 people in stormtrooper uniform. 50,000 of them had become Hilfspolizisten, auxiliary police. They all had a big armband, Hilfspolizei, now invested with the authority of state. So this was a unique situation. That's why personally I'm always reluctant, to draw comparisons to the present.
Thank you. Okay, Gray Allen, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thanks very much. Thanks very much indeed for the presentation. It was excellent. I just start off with a wee aside. A small town that I know quite well in rural Germany, Südhessen, Michelstadt, there was a rounding up of Jewish citizens, and they were subjected to a mock execution. But I don't know exactly when that happened, but I suspect it was probably around about the time you were talking about. My question though is about the weight given to the reasons for the elites being quiet. You mentioned a fear of violence that was obviously palpable at the time, but you also mentioned, which I found quite shocking to be honest, a strong support for the Nazi program. Which I don't know in detail, but I thought was fairly overtly racist. So I found that quite startling. So which was it? Was it more the fear of violence, or was it more the kind of ideological commitment to what the Nazis were about?
Well, first, let me say, your example of Michelstadt in Odenwald, I know it well. That might well have been in 1933. I remember, and I've mentioned this in the book too, in Hessen, in northern Hessen, there were a number of these mock executions. The Nazis liked to do that, instill fear in people. No one was shot. But so the example you mentioned with the mock executions, well, I didn't find any documentation on Michelstadt, but that might have fallen through the cracks, might have happened in 1933. Now, your question, what was stronger, fear or attraction? Impossible to say. They both sort of, they fed each other. There was reason for fear. That's something we really tend to forget. What struck me when I first began my research on this other book in the 1990s was that social prominence did not protect you. For example, already in March 1933, the house of Friedrich Ebert's widow, Friedrich Ebert was the first president of the Weimar Republic, her house was searched. Einstein's house was also ransacked. Now, Einstein was in America, so his empty house was ransacked, but still, it was after all Einstein. So no matter who you were, Nazis would attack you. Social prominence didn't shield you. And so many of these people clearly were afraid. Keep in mind, the opening of the Dachau concentration camp. Dachau had been a Pulverfabrik, so ammunition was manufactured in Dachau, the town north of Munich. That was announced in the newspapers. So on the 20th of March, newspaper article, this coming week, a camp will be opened in Dachau for communists and social democrats. So people in 1933 already feared, that something might happen to me. And they knew, they had heard about the brutality. So that fear was palpable. Then on the other hand, with the popularity, well, you know how it is. Many people felt we can't escape this regime, so we might as well join it loudly. It seemed to me that the popularity of the Nazi regime was really genuine in many cases. You see, many members of these elites had been anti-Republican. They never felt at home in the Weimar Republic. They were at home in the empire, but the empire had lost the war, was outdated, and no one wanted to this rigid class structure to come back. So this enthusiasm for Nazism, this genuine feeling that we are in a society that is about to be reborn, was genuine. It's impossible to say which factor was stronger, but both factors were there.
Thank you. Okay. Well, I'm gonna read out a few questions now, mindful of the time, and we'll see how many we can get through. So Jenny Eagle has asked, the mention of Breslau makes me think of how problematic it must have been to hold Nazis accountable for crimes committed in what had become Poland and Russia after 1945. Soviet authorities never held anyone accountable for crimes committed in Königsberg/Kaliningrad, did they? Another question, what happened in Gliwice specifically? And someone else has asked for the name of the historian from Breslau, which was Fritz Stern. Fritz Stern, yeah, I'll type that in. Okay, I'll leave it there for now.
Let me briefly say something to the questions. Number one, of course, it's impossible then to bring German soldiers to book, German soldiers who, shot Soviet POWs. Later, when people were taken captive, the German soldiers were very, very made sure to cut out the SS identification number. And I know quite a number of Germans who sort of have older Germans, a piece of flesh missing up here because they knew if they fell into Soviet captivity, well, they would never be let go. The question was about Königsberg. So if I understood the question correctly, the question was, what about the crimes the Soviets committed in Königsberg and other places in East Prussia and Pomerania?
No, I'm sorry, that was not the question. It was Soviet authorities never held anybody accountable for Nazi crimes committed in Königsberg.
I'm very glad.
My apologies.
Okay. Well, no, I mean, of course. I mean, yeah, that's possible. I was just going to say, Soviet authorities to this day, well, they never acknowledge any sort of Soviet violence in the eastern provinces of Germany. Mm. But yes, absolutely. They didn't hold anyone accountable. Yes. So can you, I mean, I'm not sure whether I fully understand the question.
Sorry,
So sorry,
what
go
were
ahead.
we going to say?
I mean, you go ahead.
Sorry, I mean, because those areas were transferred to Soviet control post-war, I mean, in 1933, from 1933 to 1945, of course, they were under Nazi rule.
Right.
And there were a lot of crimes committed against Jews.
I see what you mean. I see. Oh, of course not. Oh, God. Please keep one thing in mind. Well, the population of Königsberg and other towns was driven out. So, in other words, when the Soviets then took over the northern part of East Prussia, well, there were very few, if any, Germans left. So they were all driven out, and no one was held accountable. Absolutely not. See what I mean, right?
Yes, yes, I knew they were expelled. Yes, thank you very much.
And by the way, the name of the historian, I mean, he died about maybe 10 or 12 years ago, Fritz Stern. His autobiography, Five Germanys I've Known, that's really a book I can really strongly recommend. There are a number of historians' autobiographies on this period. Another one is written by Peter Gay, very famous Yale historian. His original name was Peter Fröhlich, and then he had, translated his last name Fröhlich into Gay. And in 1998, he wrote a book, an autobiography, My German Question. And at times I assign it for my students. Powerful book, yeah, very, very interesting to read. And I like these personal documents because they really bring history to life, and they are so readable. So another really great book. Peter Gay, My German Question.
Right, thank you. So we will have to call things to a close in about 5 minutes. I'm gonna just choose two of the questions that are still in the chat. Apologies to everyone else. One is, I have a question about the relationship between violence from above and below in March 1933. How much control did the NSDAP leadership still have, or how effective were Hitler's and Frick's calls for order in mid-March? Research here seems to have different estimates of the amount of violence after these calls.
May I answer it?
Yes, yeah, go ahead.
Well, great question. Absolutely, very relevant. Now, the violence we've been talking about, of course, was violence from below by Nazi stormtroopers. Beginning on the 10th of March already, Hitler issued orders. He said, I've heard that communist instigators among you have perpetrated these terrible crimes. Please stop. This won't do us any good at all abroad. This will discredit the regime. Now, it's very true. These admonishments to Nazi stormtroopers had very, very little effect. So this was a kind of grassroots violence. They were out of bounds. And initially, Hitler's strong urgings to stop it had very, very little effect. Then, as I said, later on, it would peter out. But of course, these people knew, well, no matter what we do, we won't be held accountable for it. There was also a great deal of theft, a great deal of destruction of property, senseless destruction of property, a great deal of violence for sheer amusements. So in my chapters on violence against foreign Jews, I mention how Nazi stormtroopers would, singe the beards of religious Jews in synagogues to amuse themselves, force them to eat pork, force them to sing nationalist songs, and so on. There was no one there to stop them. So, very, very good question. It took a long time before the leadership got a handle on this, so to speak.
Great. Okay, final question from Victoria Barnett. Do you look at all at the anti-Semitic violence in the early 1930s, before January 1933, and what the reaction to that was before the Nazis came to power?
There was really relatively little. There were a number of prominent instances. The Kurfürstendamm-Krawalle in 1931. I just wrote an article on anti-Semitic violence during the Weimar Republic, on anti-Semitism during the Weimar Republic. There was a great deal of social anti-Semitism, but relatively little violence. And there were, in November 1923, there was some violence in the Scheunenviertel in Berlin, but again, sporadic. And as I said, the big difference between the Weimar Republic and 1933 was that violence through the Republic was actually the courts and and the police went after these people, and some got stiff sentences, not all of them. But there was, in terms of sheer numbers, really relatively little. That's why I was so astonished. So it was from a very, very low level. Keep in mind, there was a great deal of political violence, violence against social democrats and against communists. For example, in Prussia, more than 100 people were killed in political fights in July 1932 alone. That is to say, in the run-up to the election campaign of July 31st, there were fights between Nazi stormtroopers and members of the Communist Red Front Fighters League or the Reichsbanner Schwarz-Rot-Gold. Many people were killed, but this was political violence, not anti-Semitic violence. So there was relatively little.
Fantastic. Thank you. I know there are more questions, but I think we will have to draw things to a close there. So please join me in thanking once again Professor Hermann Beck for this really wide-ranging talk and discussion, and thanks also to Dr. Toby Simpson for engaging in discussion with Professor Beck, and thanks to all of you as well for your fascinating questions. We hope to see you again at a future event. But for now, wherever you are, have a good rest of your day, and goodbye for
Great
now.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.